This video is sponsored by Audible.
So as many of you already know, my partner Ashley is also a maker. She does jewelry making, embroidery work, she does woodworking and all sorts of other things. And the one thing that she doesn't have is her own workspace. She works at her coffee table, she works on the couch, and occasionally she works in the wood shop here, but she doesn't have her own workbench. So that's what I'm gonna do today. I'm gonna build Ashley a workbench. So this is where I'm thinking, right here.
Yeah.
Like, what do you need to store in there?
I want to have drawers for all of the kind of tiny bits and bobs, like my embroidery floss and my beads. And then on the opposite side, I want to have space for flat stocks, so like journals and finished pieces, canvas, and then a couple of cubbies for fabrics. I mean, I'd like to have space for sewing kind of this side where I'd be able to have the machine and then have kind of all my scraps and stuff. So just having a little side table that I can kind of pull out and put back as needed.
All right, so I think I have everything, but we need to paint the wall.
Yeah.
What color do you want to paint it?
Pink?
We can do pink.
Following Ashley's requests, I designed most of the structural elements of this workbench out of steel. I chose this mostly because she wants a side table that pulls out and can support a sewing machine, but can be put away, doesn't take up much space. And if I were to build it out of wood, it would probably be pretty bulky, but out of steel, I can make it really nice and thin. I'm using 1x1 square tubing on this build, and I like this stuff. It's a nice size, it's very strong, and it's not too expensive. I think I spent about $80 on it. I set up my metal shop a couple years ago. If you guys have seen the melting table build, I set it up so I could weld legs for that piece, and this has become a very serviceable metal shop. I don't have a whole lot of tools in here, but you don't really need a whole lot to set up a metal shop. You really just need some way of making your cuts and some way of joining those cuts together. For making my cuts, I like to use a portaband. I have a foot pedal to turn it on and off, and I have an aftermarket table for it. And I find this setup is really versatile. After a few cuts, you can get really used to cutting nice square lines with it. And I like to notch out my joints, which the portaband does super well. As a very visual person, I like to keep a sketchbook close by whenever I'm working on anything. And I also like to write down a full cut list when I'm making a whole bunch of repeated cuts, so I don't get anything confused. I don't have to think about it. I can kind of just zone out and make all my cuts all at once. With all my stock cut down to size, I could then start setting up for the details. I'm going to be adding leveling feet to the base of this workbench, and in order to do that, I need to drill some holes so the leveling feet have a place to go through the steel. I have a stepped drill bit installed in my drill press, and this is one of the best drill bits to use for drilling metal. Each step is a different diameter, and it doesn't pull the metal up the flutes like a normal drill bit. It just sort of scrapes it away, and I find that I get really, really clean results with this tool. This 1x1 square tubing is pretty thin walled, and so I figured tapping was not an option. So what I'm doing is I'm just prepping to weld on some nuts. The nuts already have the threading in them, and so I'm just going to use this hold down. Big thank you to Chris Zepp from Make Everything Shop. He recommended this hold down. It's not very expensive, and it is great at holding these little tiny parts. Back in the metal shop, I laid out all of the parts that I just cut, and I felt like there was something missing. I still needed something on the top to support the light fixture, and I quickly puzzled out a design. I wanted the end cap to look really interesting, so I cut it on a 45-degree angle, and then left a tab down below that I could hammer closed to close off the tube. On the opposing end, I cut out another notch so that I could attach it to the rear tube, and it also closes off the top section and gives it a nice clean look. With all the steel parts made for the workbench, I was ready to weld, and I'm sure I'll get a bunch of questions about the welder I use. I have a very basic welder. It's a MIG welder. It's 120 volt, plugs into a regular wall outlet, and it's great for thin-walled things. You're not going to be welding quarter-inch plate with this, but for this style of welding, for just thin-walled tubing, it's perfect. After a bit of welding practice with the end caps, I was ready to do a full assembly. To hold that assembly together, I'm going to be using these arrow clamps. These are magnetic clamps that are really affordable. They're like 30 bucks for a 4-pack, and they just hold everything nice and square so that while you're welding, nothing shifts around. Also, I'm only tack welding at this point. If you were to run a full bead along these joints, there's a good chance that you're adding too much heat to the equation and the whole assembly will start to warp. So I'm just tack welding all the corners first, and then I'll go back over the top of them and weld them together. All the parts up until this point just kind of lock into place, except for this back corner. I want to make sure that that is the exact same width on the front as the back, so that it's nice and level when the assembly goes together at the end. I'm never going to claim to be a professional welder, but I'm pretty happy with these beads, and honestly, with a little bit of grinding, they look fine. Now that the frames are complete, let's take a minute to thank the sponsor.
As you guys know, I make a lot of repetitive things in my shop, things like pattern plywood, dozens of picture frames, and when I do that, I like to listen to audiobooks. Audible is the sponsor of this week's video, and it's perfect timing. I spent all of last week making cutting boards for my friends and family, and the entire time I was listening to Audible. I discovered an audiobook called The Design of Everyday Things by Don Norman, and it's a really great listen. I'd never studied industrial design, so it was really nice to get a glimpse into that world, and it certainly helped me when it came to designing Ashley's workbench. You can find this audiobook and thousands more on Audible, and now with the Audible Plus catalog, you can listen to podcasts, guided meditations, fitness programs, all sorts of things. Every month, Audible members get one free audiobook and free access to the Audible Plus catalog. Visit audible.com/Michael Alm or text Michael Alm to 500-500 to start your Audible membership today. Again, that's audible.com/Michael Alm or text Michael Alm to 500-500. Thanks, Audible. Now let's get back to the build.
In order to turn the metal frames into a functioning workbench, I need both a top and a back. And for that, I had a 5-foot by 5-foot sheet of Baltic birch plywood. This stuff is great for this. It's a little awkward to handle because it's just wider than your arm span, but it turned out to be perfect because I was able to get both the top and the back out of this single sheet. Planning ahead a little bit, I knew that I had the weld bead on the inside of those joints on the steel, and so I just ran over the back side of the back panel with a chamfer bit in my router. It was at this point that I realized that I didn't have a good way of connecting the two together. So what I decided to do was take it back over to the workbench and drill a bunch of holes. I'm using that same tapered bit on the back. I'm gonna drill a large hole on the outside, and then on the inside where it connects to the wood panel, I'm gonna drill a smaller hole, one that's wider than the threads of my screw, but smaller than the head of my screw. You'll notice that I'm using these Rockler one-handed bar clamps a lot. They're super handy to have in both the woodworking shop and apparently the metal shop too. They don't have a great way to fix your things to this table, so they're a good stopgap for that. I also figured that before I assemble everything, I might as well put in the leveling feet. So I bought these leveling feet. I'll post a link down below, but they are a little bit too long. They're taller than an inch, and I don't want them to bind up inside of the tube. So I made this little shuttle. It's just super glued together really quickly, and I like to have these because otherwise there's a chance that the bolt will bind in the blade, and this just makes cutting them really easy. Now I'm ready for assembly. So I just laid one of the sides on the back. All four of these sides are identical, which is really nice. And then I can set the top in. Again, this backboard has the chamfer on the back edge of it so that it can sit between those welds. With the backboard roughly in position, I could clamp it down, raise up the whole assembly, and then screw it in from the back. Next step is to install the...
Don't do that.
The next step is to put on the workbench top. You'll notice I left a good size overhang on the front end of this workbench. That's great for clamping things too, and I know that Ashley's gonna have a bench pin for jewelry making. It'll be a great spot to hang that. With the back and the bench top in place, I can now slot in the two other assemblies. These are gonna form the side walls between the different storage cubbies and drawers. And it's really important to make sure that they are perpendicular all the way down. So I made a couple of blocks that were the right size, and I can just clamp those into place and then screw in the assembly. Each of the sides mounts in with 2 screws from the back and 2 screws from underneath. Once I had all the sides secured, I could then remove the blocks that I had for spacing, and then it's time to build some cabinets. I'm very curious if people would be interested in plans for this build. I designed this as a pretty simple build, to be honest. It doesn't require a lot of experience welding, and it doesn't require a lot of experience woodworking. If you'd be interested in a set of plans and building your own workbench, let me know in the comments down below and sign up for my email list. As soon as they're available, I'll email people. I hope to get them available by the next video. The next video, I'll be covering building drawers for this and also covering the organization for the back panel. So if you're interested in that, let me know in the comments down below and I'll start working on some plans. There's lots of different ways to join cabinet sides together, and I'm just gonna go with the easiest way I know, which is pocket holes. I don't have issues with doing pocket holes on shop furniture. I wouldn't do this if this was a piece of fine furniture for a client, but for this application, it's totally fine. I also like the idea that I can disassemble these as I need. Essentially, I've built the whole thing with screws, so I could actually flat pack this workbench without any problem and then reassemble it. So if we ever move, if we ever have to take this with us, it'd be really easy to pack up and go. Back at the metal shop, I'm ready to install the cabinets. And in order to do that, I made this little jig, I guess you'd call it, so that I could set the cabinet on top. It's approximately at the right height. I've made it a little bit short so that I could lift up the cabinet to the correct height and then screw it into place. The cabinet was a nice snug fit, and the nice thing about it is that if these legs were out of square at all, this trues everything up. Off camera, I drilled some holes into the sides of the cabinets, just pre-drilled, made sure it was wider than the threads of my screw, and then I could screw them into place. If you're sitting there wondering what the heck kind of screw I'm using to screw into steel, this is what's known as a self-tapping screw, and it has like a drill bit on the tip of it, and that allows it to drill into metal, and then it creates its own threads inside. The screws that I'm using are intended for cement board. They cut through steel just fine, but the reason I chose this one specifically is because a lot of the sheet metal screws have either a pan head on them or they have a hex drive, and this one has a flat head. So it worked well for this application. One note about this style screw is that it's very easy to strip out the threads that it creates, so make sure you don't over torque it. It's really important that these cabinets be perfectly parallel to the top of the workbench. I wanted a 3-inch spacing in between, and to do that, I secured the top 2 screws in the front, and then I removed the jig from underneath, and then raised the cabinet to the correct height using a 3-inch block. I held the cabinet into place with a one-handed clamp, and then secured it with a screw. I left the backs off of these cabinets for now. Eventually I'll go in and attach a back. It'll strengthen the whole structure, but for now, while I'm building other parts of the cabinet, it's just easier to leave them off. Now I'm going to start making the pull-out tabletop, and for that, I want really accurate measurements. I want to make sure it fits into this area snugly and it doesn't have too much play in it. So I've stacked up the materials that I'm going to use in the build, and then I can measure off of that and get a practical measurement off the actual cabinet. So the techniques that I'm going to be using to make this side table are exactly the same techniques that I used to make the sides of the workbench. This is a really practical way to build. It's super fast to build this way, and once you understand these techniques, you can make a lot of stuff with it. Just like on the base of the workbench, I'm going to be attaching leveling feet to the bottom of the side table. This is pretty critical to the function of the side table because my concrete floor is not very level, and so the leveling feet will allow it to work properly. Another element that I'm adding to this tabletop is a pair of furniture glides. These are usually put on the bottom of a chair to make sure that it doesn't scratch up floor. In this case, it's going to be taking the weight of the tabletop as it slides in and out of its compartment. The last thing to do on the side table is to secure the top with a couple screws, and then I can slide it into place. It worked surprisingly well on the first go. I thought I was going to have to do a lot more adjustments, but it worked great. I was able to take my full body weight, which I think is pretty impressive, and the furniture glides worked surprisingly well.
So this obviously is not done. There's some more to do, but I'm gonna bring Ashley out and show it to her at this stage. I think I'm gonna save the rest of the build, the drawers, the dividers, and the organizers for the back panel for the next video. Real quick, before I bring Ashley in, I wanted to thank this week's sponsor. Thank you, Audible, for supporting my channel. Audible.com/Michael Alm, check it out down below. I also wanted to mention that this was intended as part of the Rockler Desk Challenge, which was an awesome event put on by Rockler and the guys at the Modern Maker podcast. I obviously got this in a little too late. It ended about a month ago, but you can go check out all the other desk designs that are on there. There's some really incredible ones. I'll post links down below. All right, so let's bring Ashley in and see what she thinks.
You ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Come on in.
Oh, it looks so good.
What do you think?
It looks so good. You think, Winston? Can I pull on it?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
It doesn't have a stop on it yet, so.
It looks awesome. I love it.
There you go.
What do you think, Winston? You love it? No? He hates it. Yay! I love it. What do you think, Winston? Oh, your feet are dirty.
Oh no. What?